Okay, thank you very much. My talk is on sustainable energy transition, particular cases from Ethiopia, and the focus will be why do urban households in Ethiopia still depend on multiple fields. So my name is Abebe, Senior Research Fellow at Environment and Climate Research Center, based at the Policy Studies Institute, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. My talk outline is presented as follows: brief background, including the modern energy supply of the country, a little bit on the theoretical aspect that's explained by the energy ladder hypothesis, and also some findings from our case study, recent study conducted in Addis Ababa, and then based on the data that's collected in Addis, we're going to talk about determinants of energy choice for various cooking activities, and also some emphasis on reliability of electricity, the problems, the challenges associated with that, and finally we conclude. As a background, around 600 million people in Africa, or 43% of the total population, lack access to electricity. And this indicates, including Ethiopia, they're already off track from reaching, the CDG goal or achieving the CDG goal by 2030. Despite, the improvement in access to electricity over the last few years, the figure shows like for Ethiopian case, 55.4% on average, and almost all urban households got access to electricity while the rural households are lagging behind. So that's why, it just reduces the average of this 55.4 total access. Ethiopia generated electricity from almost renewable energy sources, where more than 90% is from hydro and some 8% from wind, and the remaining is produced from other sources like solar and geothermal. But the country has a significant amount of resources. For example, from hydro, it can generate up to 45,000 megawatt, and for wind, for instance, it can also generate more than 100 gigawatt. Despite all these potentials and efforts, around 86% of the population still depend on, biomass energy sources like fuel, charcoal, agricultural residue, and so on, for cooking and baking or even for lighting. So why should we worry about, huge dependence on this biomass by people in this country? Because high dependence on biomass leads to, environmental problems like deforestation and forest degradation, soil erosion, and loss of biodiversity. When there is soil erosion, when there is deforestation and forest degradation, that directly affects, production and productivity and hence food security. Another major problem is there is a serious effect on health. For example, through indoor air pollution, for example, those households, or generally in Ethiopia, a recent study showed that more than 39,000 people died every year because of this indoor air pollution. And even the figure is much higher than this one by some of the issues like WHO cites sometimes 40, 50,000 people die in the country because of this indoor air pollution. So both the environmental, economic, and health problem make it, a shift to modern energy sources is crucial. The energy ladder hypothesis shows that, the transition to clean fuels like electricity and LPG becomes is a function of income, meaning that as income increases, households tend to shift to, better fuel sources like electricity and LPG from lower quality fuel sources like wood, charcoal, and so on. But this maybe true income is one of the main determinants, but a complete switching it to electricity and LPG or modern fuels is impossible. And some scholars call it fuel stacking, and that's nothing but it is just a use of mix of solid and modern energy sources. So authors like Maser et al. Since 2000, they say, use of mix of fuels, solid and clean fuels. We call it a multiple fuel is common. So there is no complete linear switching as some claim. Here also, like our case study from Ethiopia, then particularly from Addis Ababa, like the practical, based on the data collected from 2,000 households, shows that more than 92% use electricity for cooking. But more or less similar percentage also, use charcoal for cooking, indicating that, households use both electricity and charcoal for cooking purpose. Some use firewood. Very few people use actually LPG. On the other hand, the baking one, the figure shows that most households use, electricity for baking purpose. Relatively small number of people, like 23% of our sample households, depend on firewood for cooking. So compared to for baking, compared to cooking, those who are baking in general, they tend to use electricity or a better fuel than those who are cooking. So in Ethiopia, cooking and baking do require different kinds of stoves, so they can use both biomass and modern fuels. Lighting is completely dependent on electricity. Now, what determines really the choice of these energy sources for various activities in our case? So studies show that, household characteristics are very important. As I said, income is very important because you need to be able to afford, the price for, modern fuels. Not only on modern fuels, you need to be able to afford also the price for, cooking technologies also. Education is related to better awareness. And those who are better aware are expected to be, dependent on modern fuels than, biomass, because they know very well, the problem or shortcoming of, using firewood and charcoal, both environmental and health-related aspects. Household size determines, it varies from, study, but that's also very important, the gender and so on, gender of the cook. The taste and the preferences, the culture also matters. The price of alternative fuels, whether that is a substitute or a complement, is also important. And another important factor is unreliability of electricity supply, which makes most people in Addis or in Ethiopia as a whole dependent on biomass fuel. Is something that we need to consider. The nature of the kitchen type, whether it is shared or separate, the nature of the house itself, and so on, all the different characteristics that depends on, the context, the geographical area, and so on, affect the choice of energy source. So all this leads to what we call fuel stacking paper. That is, people use a mix of both solid and clean fuel. So there is no complete switching of, households to better fuels. That's even if they are rich, they still depend on, biomass. The data, the figures, for example, from the example or from the studies that we had in Addis Ababa shows that reliability is very, very important. Respondent responded that, there's almost 4 blackouts per week, and the total number of hours, the duration of power outage is something like 9.4 hours. This is very, very significant according to the respondents. And because of this, some people even prefer to depend or prefer to cook on, charcoal instead of electricity, because electricity can go off any time. So reliability is very, very important. Why electricity supply is unreliable? There are so many factors. Some important factors are like old and overloaded infrastructure, which leads to failure in transmission line, the poor and managerial capacity, and sometimes, high energy demand, which is greater than, the capacity of the grid, and sometimes issues with system stability, which leads to protection and combination failure, or leading to finally widespread blackout. So we need to push household to or these factors, and reliability combined with all other factors, push these households to shift, biomass as backup source. For example, we asked households, what kind of energy source do you use for a backup? For lighting purposes, it's very common to use candle, for instance. More than 75% responded that they use candle. Surprisingly, for cooking, when there is power interruption, more than 86% of households depend on charcoal for cooking purpose. You can you can imagine how charcoal is very important as a source of energy for cooking purpose. And if households think that electricity can go off any time, then they want to start even using they want to start cooking using charcoal, because at the middle of the cooking activity, the light or the electricity may go off. And also for another injera baking, we were expecting a lot of people to say, firewood is the backup source. But surprisingly, we get a figure that when there is a power outage or when there is a power interruption, more than 41% or around 40% respond that they buy injera. Something that raises an important question, how this injera is being commercialized is a research question by itself. So people use, biomass. Of course, some say 30%, 13%. One three said firewood is considered as a backup source. Some say charcoal, showing that there is a shift in the meal. They want to have like pasta or others which doesn't require, injera. So, as a way of conclusion, then we can see that households use a mix of both, modern and biomass energy sources for the day-to-day activities. That's in Ethiopia. It's also common in other African countries, and there are several factors, including household characteristics, culture and preferences, the price, and others affect which type of energy source to use for cooking and baking activities. That is, energy transition then requires several measures. Yeah, so the households also suggest that incentives is very, very important. For example, how can the household afford to buy, clean cooking, technologies that uses electricity? That's very expensive these days, and unless there is something arranged to ease, the liquidity constraint of these households, it's very difficult to possess or to buy that equipment. So there should be some kind of incentive. There should be some kind of subsidies for alternative fuels like electricity. Well-designed, subsidies may be important, particularly for the poor households. Awareness, we say so many times awareness, but that shouldn't be in a one-time movement. So it should be continuously, provided to the household how this biomass is so harmful, how it negatively affects the environment, the health, and so on, compared to the clean fuels. And the other one, which is from the government side, the most important thing is enhance the quality of the power supply by taking various kinds of measures. That's very, very important in order to make households dependent on electricity. Of course, this requires, the coordination of the various relevant actors or stakeholders so that they can provide very effective and efficient service. That is what I have for today. And then if anybody wants to communicate further on this one, then they can write me, communicate me through my email. Thank you very much.